The People's Platform.
Good evening and welcome to the People's Platform. Now, the Gratiaen Trust was founded in 1992 by internationally renowned writer of Sri Lankan origin Michael Ondaatje, funded with his Booker Prize money for his novel The English Patient. Ondaatje's vision was to establish a trust that would recognize and promote creative writing in English by Sri Lankan authors resident in Sri Lanka. Last week saw the 31st award ceremony take place in Colombo. My guest tonight is Dr. Ramya Jirasinghe, whose father Cabral's recipe for love cake bagged the prestigious Gratiaen Prize. Good evening and welcome to the show, Ramya.
Thank you, Sonali.
Congratulations.
Thank you. Good
How does it feel to win the coveted Gratiaen Prize?
Surreal. Surreal because I didn't expect to win.
Okay.
I've never thought I'd win because I've been shortlisted twice before.
Yeah.
From a very early age when I started writing. So 25 years of writing and no Gratiaen Prize. So this was a little surprise.
Yeah, and there were some fantastic writers in the shortlist as well.
Yes. So that was the thing. I mean, I was competing against two previous winners and two very accomplished writers.
Yeah.
So I really didn't think I had much of a chance.
Okay, great. So as a precursor to the conversation, I'd like you to read out an excerpt from your manuscript, which is as yet unpublished.
Yeah. So what I'll do is I'll read the opening para. So the character is... There are two timelines. So this character is called Katharina and is from the contemporary timeline. Okay. And the book opens with this para. Donna Isabella Katharina Silvaria, 33 years old and new owner of Santiago, the house with the first veranda in the island fort, knows this about the cake from which she makes her living. A good love cake is like the memory of a lost lover's kiss. The cake's aroma when it comes out of her oven is as familiar to her as the scent of the single frangipani she tucks behind her ear. She understands how the cake mellows in the cooling cupboard at the end of the corridor, the way she feels her pillow soothing her at midday, when the heat of the sun leaps off the sea outside her house and creeps in through the latticed windows. She knows its dark interior as well as she knows how easily its moist crumbs could collapse against the blade of a knife. She also knows that her cake, like any love, must fan itself into the future. Silence and distance are water on raging flames. She knows all this about her bolo di amore, even though she has no time for love. Katharina lives only for her cake and her house.
Ramya, the love cake is originally introduced to Sri Lanka by the Portuguese. Speak to us about why you picked this very visceral imagery for your book.
So the love cake is possible only because of our colonial experience, right? I mean, it includes things like spices, like nutmeg, cinnamon, cashew nut, all of which we've got because of our colonial enterprise.
Right.
And for that reason, this whole book runs on this, the impact of colonialism on our current lives.
Right.
So love cake becomes the center of the whole novel.
Speak to us also about these two timelines that you speak of. One is set in the past and one, just to clarify that.
Yes, so there is a 17th century timeline and then a contemporary timeline. So what I read was from the contemporary timeline. So what the book is trying to do is to show that our colonial experience, like countries like Sri Lanka, have been devastated from that experience, and it's not an experience that you can say ended with independence. Yeah. That experience continues, it shapes people's lives, it destroys people's lives still, even though we don't realize the cause of that destruction lies maybe 3-4 centuries behind us. So the whole book tries to kind of make that real by bringing in human characters.
Okay. How do we go about decolonizing our mind?
I think it's extremely hard to do because we are conditioned through that colonizing process, and it's so much part of our lives. I really don't think we can completely decolonize ourselves without destroying most of the things that make us whole. I think decolonizing is not really possible in that sense, but living with understanding of the impact it has had on our lives is the only way forward, I think.
Because internationally also there is a conversation about reparations for countries that were colonized.
You know, it's so funny that you use the word reparation, because this book, once I wrote this book, I wrote it during lockdown, and after I wrote the book, I sent it out to several agents, and everyone said no, but one person picked it up.
Okay.
And then for 3 months we worked on the book, and she tried to publish it, get it published through publishers in the UK. And the title she gave the book was Reparation.
Seriously?
Yes.
Okay.
It's so funny that you came up with that word. Yes.
Yeah.
So that's the word that she used. That's the title that she selected for it, because it made more sense in the kind of the global context.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Okay.
So yes, so reparation is very current.
Ramya, you also jointly won the State Literary Prize for your collection of poetry alongside Vivi Marie van der Putten. Speak to us about how you made the transition from poetry to prose.
I think the reason I wrote this first paragraph was because I had that kind of affinity to poetry, because this paragraph was written because The Guardian in 2009 had a competition for the opening para of a fictional book.
Right.
And I was one of the joint runners-up.
Okay.
And I think I found it so easy to write this paragraph because it was short. You know, a paragraph is a short piece of work, and that's what poetry can be. So because of that, I found it easier to move from poetry to prose and into a longer form fiction. But of course it took a long time to sit down to it.
Right. Speak to us also about some of the themes that move you. You write about love, loss, belonging, conflict. Talk to us about why you choose those themes and why those move you, because your day job is in the development sector, working with children.
Yes. I don't know whether a writer consciously, at least not at the start, sits down and decides to write on a particular theme. I don't know. That's not how I started, because there are certain things that move you.
Yeah.
And then you write about those things. I think over time what happens is you realize this is what moves me. You do it more consciously, I guess. So now I guess I'm doing it more consciously. But at the start you don't. And I guess you're drawn towards what interests you. So professionally also I'm working in something that feels useful in some way to somebody. So, and my writing, I guess, touches on it, but in a fictionalized form.
You attribute your entry to writing to Anne Ranasinghe. Speak to us about that as well.
So, I've always loved writing. I started writing when I was very small, but it was Anne Ranasinghe who kind of took me under her wing when I first sent a poem to her magazine, the Channels magazine, which she founded. And she became a mentor and sort of a guru, and it was a very interesting kind of mentorship, because in Sri Lanka it's very hard to find honest criticism. I probably know about 2 or 3 people who tell me honestly, you know, this is really not good. People normally don't say that to your face, and Anne did.
Right.
And once you have that criticism, you're always kind of questioning yourself, is this okay?
There are a lot of young writers in Sri Lanka who lack this guidance, who lack mentorship, who lack direction, frankly. Speak to us about this process of writing. How does one stop all else and write? How does one prioritize one's own writing? Because writing it isn't something that you do to generate an income, right? It's something you do because you're passionate about it. So speak to us about that whole process.
I mean, fiction really has no money in Sri Lanka, very little money. So I think the most important thing a young person needs to remember is that you will not have time. because you're trying to, if you are in a profession, you're trying to write, you're trying to make a living. So that's one of the reasons probably even I couldn't sit down and do a novel of 85,000 words before COVID.
Right.
Because COVID kind of locked us inside our houses and we had to sit somewhere and write.
Sure.
We could use our time in a way that we hadn't time before. And so that is, I think it's a matter of prioritizing, but most people don't have that time. And we probably lose out a lot of possible winners because people can't afford to spend that time.
Ramya, the process of writing leading up to publication is an ordeal of its own. How did you manage to sort of circumvent the process?
Well, I haven't circumvented it yet.
Okay.
I haven't found a publisher.
For your current book?
For my current book, I haven't
yeah.
found a publisher. First book, I self-published because nobody, for fiction, you might find publishers, and you do.
Right.
I mean, you get Perera Hussein, you get Sirasa, you do get
Sure.
the publishers for that. And if they are good and if they are confident, they'll take you. But for poetry, very few would take. So the first book was self-published. The second book was, of course, an experience in trying to get it published outside Sri Lanka, which takes a lot of determination. So I sent it out to publishers.
Okay.
Hundreds of publishers, and again, it only takes one. One person wrote back and said, I'm interested. So that's how I got it published. And so with the novel, it's a very different process because
Okay.
a novel, you can't submit it to a publishing house.
You have to go through
Outside
an
Sri Lanka,
agent.
you have to go through an agent. And finding an agent is as hard as finding a publishing house. And again, the same process.
Okay, can you take us through that process?
Yes, I mean, I'd like to share this with any other young aspiring writers. So you have to write a pitch letter with the synopsis about the book, synopsis about yourself, synopsis about where you think the book sits in terms of a body of literature, and then you have to identify suitable agents. Luckily, the internet helps. And once you do that, then you have to send maybe an opening chapter or whatever, and then hold your breath because it takes about 3 months for them to write back.
Really?
And if you don't hear from them in 3 months, that means it's gone into their dustbin.
Okay.
You know, and many people don't write back. But then again, it only takes one person. You know,
Right.
so when one person responds, you're through.
But even in that process, do you end up questioning yourself?
So it's an affirmation when someone accepts it. Because an agent also has to believe in the book.
Sure.
Because that person is taking the book on to then send it to a publisher, hoping a publisher. So she's also hedging her bets.
Right.
You know? So it really gives you a lot of confidence and also support to think, right, someone is willing to believe in this book with me. You know?
Okay. Ramya, you have another excerpt from your manuscript for us. This deals with the power dynamics during the colonial period and what colonization did to the country's locals.
It was a good year for pepper. Everyone knew this. All the planters who cultivated pepper vines waited for the harvesting to end when they would begin the risky business of bargaining with African traders while saving themselves from the company. Each day, Raina's workers left their houses bearing large wicker baskets on their backs to harvest the berries on her plantation. She walked with them, talking and along the narrow pathways through the trellises on which the vines climbed, filling the frames with their thick branches, greedily searching for space. She followed the workers as they plucked the clusters of red berries, and after they moved on, she checked each vine for any they had left behind. She and her son worked alongside the harvesters, helping them when they could not finish the acres they had to clear in a day. All ripe, all clean. This is the best we have had for a long time, the best since Negochi died. Her chief farmer, Sefiro, watching her dipping her hands into a wicker basket, said, scooping up clusters of berries. The small red fruit dangled from delicate stems, and her hands took on the red hue of the berries as the light bounced off them. Too much is not good, too little is not good. If all we can sell the whole crop, Soon we shall be happy. The company is calling for pepper, Sirasa said. Raina dropped the clusters into the basket, dusted her hands off and stood up. We will never sell to them. Don't ever forget that. Those murderers will not get one of these from me. She picked up a cluster and stabbed the air with it. Not one green berry. The African traders are trapped. It is hard for them to come out to collect the harvest. The company is killing them off one by one. Then what do we do? Who will buy the pepper? One of the working women, who was bent over a basket close to them, pulling the berries of the clusters, spoke for all to hear. We all know who will buy the pepper then. The workers paused and looked up, holding their breath. Not the pepper on my land. For now, you do your work. When the company takes over the pepper, all of you can leave. There will be no work for anyone on this land. The workers kept their heads bent over the vines and the baskets. Sirasa said, but they will take your pepper, even if you don't give it to them. You think I don't know that? She said, and walked back into the house.
Ramya, Sri Lankans are only too familiar with this kind of sentiment. I mean, historically, with our colonial past, but also with the ethno-linguistic, ethno-religious conflict. And we see vestiges of this even today, if we go into the north, the east, the power dynamics, the helplessness, all of these heartbreaking emotions. Speak to us about how text like this must move us to be better.
Well, I think the general public is better. It's just that the people in power use these situations. So whether it's a colonial oppressor, whether it's a politician, whether it's a bunch of extremely exploitative employers, it makes no difference. The marginalized or the vulnerable are always there throughout history. And the person who plays that role of the exploiter is always also there.
Right.
So I hope texts, as you say, texts like these will kind of put a spotlight on that.
Yeah.
And say that we can't say it was just the colonial enterprise. No, it never left us. It's always there, but in different forms.
Yeah. Hopefully, our elected representatives read books like this.
I don't know. Hopefully, it's the operative word.
Yeah. Ramya, your PhD thesis, interestingly, was on liberal peace building during the end of the war and why it wasn't really successful. Do you think that your PhD thesis also sort of gave you a lens with which to understand the world? Speak to us about this.
Well, absolutely, because when you do a PhD, you do a lot of theoretical research as well. You learn about the theories behind, and that helps because, interestingly, even though a fictionalized novel is about people's lives, we don't realize we are sort of driven by conditions, and conditions have kind of themes to it, themes and kind of motivations that kind of underlie the things that impact us. So having that PhD and understanding what kind of drove the larger world, the forces behind the larger world, and how those impact even a person on the street.
Right.
You know, someone just sweeping a road doesn't realize the bigger forces that kind of maybe keeps that person there. You know, so by the peace building, the dissertation was on peace building during the end of the war. The larger theory did help and impacted how I looked at the world and how I then kind of wrote this novel.
But speaking about peace doesn't equal end of a conflict, right? There is a process, there's a path to which we need to traverse in order to get to peace.
Yes.
How do you think Sri Lanka has fared?
I think the answer is fairly easy. If you ask different people whether they feel at home in Sri Lanka is the question.
Yeah.
If you can ask them, Are you happy? Do you think you can build a life here? Sadly, a lot of people might say no, and maybe for economic reasons, but for many others who come from different ethnic groups, not just economic reasons, also with the sense of belonging. So just because a conflict has ended, it doesn't mean that there is peace. So negative peace and positive peace, one of the two famous kind of types of peace that you get in the world, we are still probably at negative peace.
The government is looking at also the establishment of a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. I'm sorry, I'm moving away from the book to transitional justice mechanisms. Do you feel like there is a trust deficit between communities that needs to be addressed before setting up such a body?
I think it all depends on the political will. You know, because ultimately the problem with Sri Lanka is that we have a majority, and if you can win an election with the votes of that majority, then you would not want to worry about, unless you're a genuine politician, worry about the conditions of the minorities. You know, so the question of trust, more than trust deficit between the communities, is more about the will that the politician needs to put into it, and whether there is a need for a politician to put that energy into that. Because if you can win through other means and stay in power, then why go down the road of also maybe upsetting your constituency?
Sure.
You know?
Yeah, I was reminded of the parallel between peace building and writing. Recently, I had the pleasure of interviewing V.V. Ganeshanandan, who went on to win an international award for her book Brotherless Night, which was just so gut-wrenching to read. Ramya, what is the intersection between writing and rights?
Well, the intersection is, I guess, very strong, because it's about voice ultimately, and who gets the right to voice their opinions, their points of view, and not get penalized for that. So to begin with, it starts with a very basic right, the right to speak. And then, of course, if you have the right to speak, then the opportunity to talk about the other rights that you may or may have lost or feel that you don't have. So writing is a vehicle, as well as it's also a right in itself. The right to write, in the sense to speak of what you don't have in terms of right, is also a right.
Yeah, beautiful. What kind of role do you think the state can play in encouraging, uplifting writers? Writers are sort of thrown to the wayside.
I wouldn't say they are thrown to the wayside, because we do have a very well-established state literary system, and an award system. So every year they celebrate the writers. They do, and the state literary awards are also, I think, in a way more representative of the minorities and all the other, because it focuses on all the languages, the three languages, you know. So in that sense, it does. I think where the state can be a problem is a problem is when people do write about things they don't want. That's the problem, right?
Yeah.
But in terms of giving people a literary platform, it does. Of course, in Sri Lanka, the problem is we don't have funding the way, like in the UK, you'd have trusts that would give a writer money to work on a book. We don't have those. And in other countries, the state does help in that sense.
Right.
We don't have funding like that.
It'll actually be a great idea if we could set up such a mechanism, right? If various interested parties could come up with such a mechanism to support maybe young writers, marginalized from marginalized communities, or from
Well, I think the Gratiaen is in a way doing a lot, because it brings in famous writers and gets local writers, exposed to them.
Sure.
So the Gratiaen is doing that.
Yes.
But I mean,
We need more.
we need more. We need more funding. So corporate funding would be very useful. That also reminds me, one of my plays is going to be staged by Tracy Holsinger.
Yes.
Yes. So if there is anyone interested in sponsoring it, I think Tracy would be delighted, because it's dealing with water as a resource and the scarcity of water, and how a small state can abuse their power with minorities and hold back those resources. So it's very political, and Mind Adventures is going to stage it in August.
Ramya, when writing a book, the editing process plays a key role. Just like in a film, the post-production and editor plays a key role. How was that for you? How has that been for you, the editing process, finding the most magical editor whose ethos resonates with yours?
That's the most important thing, the editor. And in my case, my agent went through that process with me.
Okay.
And I think the editing makes or breaks the book. Because if the editor goes through very carefully in terms of the grammar, the spelling, half the battle is won. And the chairman, Dr. Joseph Anthony, of the jury of the Gratiaen, said that was the first thing they looked for.
Really?
Well edited a piece of work, you know, and without that, I think the book can't really stand up to competition. So editing is crucial.
Right. And how did you go about finding that editor, that process that you outlined?
Yes,
Okay,
so the agent really does become an editor as well.
Sure.
Because they put that work in. Most agents are editors themselves.
Right. Right. In addition to your fiction writing, you've also dabbled in non-fiction writing. Speak to us about that and how the process differs, because there you have to be more factual and sort of rooted in fact.
Yes, yes. So I started off writing. I was commissioned in 2005 after the tsunami to write a book about the tsunami, and then in 2009 about Trinity College. So these are both commissioned works, and then there were a couple of other commissioned works after that. It's completely different because it's, as you say, you have a set of facts, you have a lot of archival matter, and you're more a feature journalist when you're doing this type of thing, but a creative element makes a difference in how you string the whole thing together.
Sure.
Yeah. So commissioned works, commissioned non-fiction also, I think, in the hands of a person with a sort of a creative bent has a different ethos to it.
Sure.
Yeah.
What can an aspiring writer do better to be a good writer?
Oh, you have to keep writing. You just have to keep writing, and also you have to take it seriously, because you can't just do shoddy work. You know, you have to work on it, you have to craft your work, and you have to read. You have to read, and this is something again Dr. Anthony said at one of the workshops he had for writers last weekend. He said what he noticed was that in Sri Lanka we are still writing like we are in the 1950s. We are reading old books. We have to read contemporary books because we have to speak like we speak now and describe situations like now. Our language is dated. You know, you have to listen to how Sri Lankans speak. And so, yeah, so it's very important to focus and be very committed to your craft. So any young writer, I would say, believe in yourself, and it's a long haul. Publishing, writing is a long haul game. No rewards, very little compensation. Don't go for the prices. Don't go for the money. There is no money. Don't go for the money. But if there is a compelling need to write, you have to stick with it. And you have to aspire to write good work, you know, and learn. And you have to learn from others.
Right. Yeah. Writing has this remarkable ability to help us comprehend perspectives across the spectrum. So perhaps we'd go into a novel with a certain ideology and then be faced with a character who bears the opposing ideology, and we're confronted with how authentic and how true their perspectives of their lived realities are, which humbles us. So writing has this power to make us come to terms with the other person's reality. How do you view this?
Well, Sonali, you just described what great literature is supposed to do, right? It's supposed to give us a worldview that we never held before, show us a different way of looking at the world. And by doing that, if you can really touch people, and that's the great thing about literature, that's what differs it from a report. I could have written a report about the 17th century pepper cultivation or whatever. The difference is you write it about an individual and it touches someone and it moves someone to think differently. And that's what, I mean, any writer would dream of doing, being able to achieve.
All right. Yes. Beautiful. Thank you so much for this conversation, Ramya Jirasinghe. I hope to read Father Cabral's Recipe for Love Cake soon when it's in print. Thank you for this conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you for watching us. We'll see you again next Friday. Good night.